Hello, welcome at ITU here at ITU itself and online. Thanks for being here, welcoming our fifth installment of professors, so to say. And today we have a very broad spectrum. On one side, we have mathematics with game theory, and on the other side, we have political science, humanities, and law, and technology, of course. So it's very, very broad. Our two experts, I'm very happy that we could convince them to come to this.
And today we will start with Christian Hilbe. He studied math. So for all the people here in math, physics, he's your guy. And of course, that's him. So he studied math at the University of Vienna, and then he did quite a lot of postdoc positions. So he went to the Max Planck Institute in Germany, then he was in Harvard, and then he was also at ISTA postdoc. And then he went back to the Max Planck Institute to become a group leader there. And from there, we could snatch him to come to ITU. And with this, I hand over to you. And we're very curious about your talk.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for coming. It's great to be here. All right, so I start with a quiz. So here are 6 pictures. What do these 6 pictures have in common? And yeah. So perhaps one thing that, I mean, here it's a little bit harder to say. But like one thing that all these pictures have in common is actually that like all these people want to be successful, or all these individuals want to be successful, but their success actually does not only depend on what they do, but it also depends on what others do. Like I guess with these 3 examples, it's obvious that my success depends on what others do. Perhaps with those 2, it's a little bit less obvious. So let me tell you the story of this picture. Like this picture is about a special species of lizards. It turns out these lizards, like all these lizards here are male. There are 3 different morphs, like 3 different phenotypes of these male lizards. You can actually clearly distinguish them from how they look like. The interesting thing is they also clearly differ in their behavior, like in their mating behavior. Like one of them is rather big, the blue one here. So they would actually try to have a large territory and have access to many mates. Then there is a smaller one, I believe it's this one. So they would actually try to have a smaller territory and only have one mate. And the last one, this is a little bit sneaker. Like this wouldn't have any territory at all. It would just walk around, and whenever there's an opportunity, this sneaker would try to like use it. That's the best way how I can formulate this. And what is interesting about this is that here there is some non-transitive competition. Like if there are many blue guys actually like who have a large territory, the sneaker would be able to invade. But if there are a lot of sneakers, then it makes sense to actually guard the one female that you have. And once everyone guards this one female, it again makes sense that you go for a large territory if you're powerful enough. And so what you see here is some kind of rock, scissors, paper cycle, if you look at the data. And yeah, also here, like you have some collective flying behavior, like, and I guess Thiago talked a little bit about this. So there are many interesting things about these collective patterns. Like here, for example, you have this V pattern. What is interesting here from a game theory perspective is that like not all these positions are equally profitable. Like you don't want to be the first one here because like that one would have the highest air resistance. So the question is like actually how do these birds coordinate actually their behavior? All right, so the structure of this talk is the following. Like, I don't assume everyone here is already an expert in game theory, so I try to give you some introduction into our thinking, what we do, how we work. And after that, I will tell you like 3 examples of the work that we've done so far. And I hope you find it exciting. All right, so with that, yeah. So what do people do in game theory? Like, what is our typical mode of action? Like, usually how projects start is like we identify some interesting behavior. And there are many different examples of what could be interesting to us. Like, for example, one question that could be interesting is like, why do people wear expensive handbags? Like, in most cases, a cheaper handbag would do. So why even invest into a more expensive one? I mean, you might have a guess, like probably it's a signal, but even then you might wonder, it's a signal for what? Like, what exactly is the information conveyed by this kind of handbag? Another interesting behavior is like contributing something to Wikipedia. Like, why would you actually make contributions to Wikipedia? Like, it takes some time. Like, most people will never learn that you were the person who made this Wikipedia article. So why would you do it? There's actually another interesting puzzle hidden in this Wikipedia article, because actually this article is on scam, like on scam emails. Also there, you might actually wonder, why do people actually write scam emails? Perhaps that's a little bit less surprising, but perhaps the surprising thing is, why are so many scam emails so obviously bad? What I mean by that is like, why would you even get emails where a person claims to be this prince from Nigeria who just made a huge fortune and just magically needs you to help this money getting to Europe or somehow? Like, why is it so obviously bad? So this is, for example, a question that you might be interested in. And like, there are articles about this, how you can make sense out of this behavior. And yeah, down there are two more examples. In the sake of time, like once you have identified some interesting behavior that you would like to make sense of, you do now the machinery of a game theorist. Like the first step would be, once you have the behavior, you try to put it into a model. Like and how this works, I will actually tell you in a minute. Once you have the model, you try to do some math, like you try to prove some statements about this model. Sometimes you also run some simulations. And in the end, what you're sometimes interested in is, like, you want to say something about like how well does your model predict actual behavior. And for that, what we sometimes do is actually running experiments. So actually there are two experimenters now in my group. So Adi and Theo, they are right here. And that's actually what they do. So these experiments work as follows. Like, you would invite some participants online, for example, you would invite them to play some games, and then you would compare like the behavior that they show, is it actually what you expected them to do? All right, so this is roughly what we do. Now, actually, how do we do this in more detail? Like, how do we actually translate some behavior into a model? And there are actually two different flavors how to do this. Like, on the one hand, there is classical game theory, and I start with that one. So if you want to do a classical game theory model, the thing that you need to do is, like, first you need to think about, okay, in this given situation, who are the relevant players? Like, and like, who is it who makes decisions here? And another question is like, what is it that they can do? And another thing is like, what is it that they know when they make a decision? And finally, you need also to specify what are their payoffs. Like, for example, you could think about, like, if you take this example of a scam email, like, who are the players, who, like, for example, like these scammers, what are their actions, like write a stupid email or write a sophisticated email? What is the information that they have, like in the beginning, nothing? What are the payoffs? So that's roughly how you would work. And to give you a simpler example, like one of the classical examples is this one. Like you might think of this game as a gift-giving game. Like, I can either give you a gift that is worth to you 15 euros, it costs me 5 euros, and you can do the same to me. So the way how you have to read this is, I can cooperate, like give you the gift, or I can defect, don't give you the gift. And my co-player can do the same. And how you have to read these numbers is like, if we both cooperate, we both give each other a gift, then we both end up with 10 euros. If you both defect, we end up with 0 euros. And like, for example, if I defect and you cooperate, I would get 15 euros. And now a game theory person would look at this payoff matrix and try to identify, try to predict what people would do in this game. Are there any guesses on what people would do in this game? I mean, one thing that you might note is actually that, I mean, the problem in general with game theory is that you don't know what the other person will do. But you could think here, okay, like, I don't know whether the co-player will cooperate or defect, but I know, like, for example, if the co-player cooperates in this example, I do better by defecting, because 15 is better than 10. And if the co-player in this case defects, I also do better than by defecting. So in this particular example, no matter what the co-player does, I always do best by defecting. So in this particular example, like the rational thing to do is to defect. And if we both do this, we both end up with €0. We could have both done better by both cooperating. Then we would have both got €10. So this is sometimes called the prisoner's dilemma. Yeah, and then what game theory people would do is like they solve the game by identifying the equilibrium of this game. And here we would identify, okay, both play defecting is the equilibrium, then we would be happy. So this game is solved. Okay, so this is classical game theory. There is another approach to do this kinds of game theory. It's evolutionary game theory. So the interesting thing about classical game theory is that it makes some assumptions on how smart or how rational people are. Like you assume, like for classical game theory, implicitly you assume that people understand what game they are playing. They understand the payoffs. Like sometimes you also need to assume that they understand that the co-player is rational. Sometimes you even need to assume that I know that you know that I know that you are rational, like all these infinite chains of knowing. So you might say that from a cognitive viewpoint, classical game theory makes quite strong assumptions. And now there's this other viewpoint, like and obviously, like classical game theory wouldn't help you to explain the behavior of lizards. Like it's quite unlikely that lizards would do this kind of reasoning. Now, evolutionary game theory doesn't make these assumptions that players actually understand the game that they are playing. Like they do not even need to be aware that they are playing the game. So what you have instead is that you have a population of players. Like here, for example, in this example, you would have just 5 individuals. 3 of them would just happen to cooperate. 2 of them would just happen to defect. And then what might happen over time is that either like players imitate each other based on their overall payoff. Like for example, this blue person might recognize that the red person has a higher payoff. So then there might be some imitation. Or you could also interpret this in a biological scenario that literally like these payoffs are translated into fitness, that literally the blue person has a smaller fitness than the red person. And therefore this blue person is more likely to die. And over time, you would have a dynamical process where successful strategies would increase. All right? So for example, in one time step, this might happen. Like this blue person sees that the defectors get a higher payoff. Therefore, this person also decides to be a defector from now on. And then one thing that we are interested in is, okay, what's the long-run dynamics of this system? There are different ways to do this. Like in math terms, like you can either do ordinary differential equations or stochastic processes. So this is one thing that we do. All right. Now, specifically, what are the applications that we study in our group? Like one application that we focus on a lot is like, why do people cooperate? And it's always good to have an example. And by cooperation, I mean, why do people pay a cost to help someone else? It's always good to have a few examples in mind. Like, for example, why do people do favors? Like, if you ask me to help you with carrying something from A to B, I would be happy to help. I shouldn't have said this in public. Another example that is relevant for scientists, like why do we review others' papers? Like like for the non-scientists, like every once in a while we are asked to evaluate other people's papers. It's quite some work. Like it would require us to read this paper, to critically evaluate this paper, to write a report. It can take days sometimes with some papers. We do this actually anonymously, so like to the public it will never be known that we did this. So why do we do it? So this is another example of cooperation. Then finally, there are actually numerous other examples in the animal kingdom of cooperation. Like one example, for example, is this vampire bat. Vampire bats need food every day. They actually need blood, like they feed from blood. And for example, if one vampire wouldn't find a victim on a given day, then sometimes another vampire bat would donate some food by actually vomiting a little bit blood and give it to the other bat. All right, so these are the kinds of questions that we have in mind. And now, like, just to make it clear, like, you might have now the feeling like it's not really a problem. Like, it's not really a good question. Why do people do costly favors? It's obvious. I can immediately tell you a few reasons why we do this. And for example, like, here are some explanations. Like, obviously, I do favors to someone else because, like, it gives me a good feeling. Like I feel now I did the right thing. Like I'm happy about it. Also, another explanation would be like, for example, with this reviewing, like some situations are actually governed by social norms. Like you feel that in this particular situation, this particular social norm applies, and this particular social norm actually requires me to cooperate in this situation. And another possible explanation is like there are also institutions that favor cooperation. Like, for example, I believe in Austria, for example, it's in the law that you are forced, that you are required to provide first aid whenever you encounter an accident. And that's all true. Like all these explanations are valid. I would still argue like they don't fully solve the problem that I have, because like in each case, you might actually wonder, okay, like why do we have these particular emotions? Like why do we feel good if we help someone else, if it actually gives us a lower fitness? Because you would think in a naive sense, like the emotions that we have, they are subject to Darwinian selection, so they should optimally prepare us for life. And the same thing is social norms. Like, why do we have the social norms that we have? Could we have completely different social norms? Like in the space of social norms, are there some restrictions? And those are the kinds of questions that we ask. So we want to know ultimate reasons why it's actually beneficial to cooperate. And there are a few ultimate explanations for cooperation. Like I mentioned 3 of them. Like one here is kin selection. That's this theory that it always helps, that it always makes sense to help your relatives. Like there's this famous saying that I would jump into the river to save 2 of my brothers or 8 of my cousins. And like this mathematics makes sense because like I share half of my genes with my brother and an 1/8 of my genes with my cousins. By the way, like, of course, the ratio is a little bit different if you have twins. I couldn't resist use this photo because actually this person here is my dad. Yeah. Yeah. And 2 other mechanisms for cooperation that I will talk more about is direct reciprocity. That's this idea that if we meet again and again, like suddenly we have different incentives to cooperate. And indirect reciprocity, that's this kind of cooperation based on social norms. All right. So let's start. So this now goes to my work. So the question here is a little bit on like in stable groups, like how can you explain cooperation and what's the effect of inequality here? So let me go back to my original question, like why do people cooperate? I already showed you this matrix. I already convinced you, hopefully, that in this game, actually the best you can do is always defect. So if this would be your model of reality, you wouldn't be able to explain why people cooperate. So why is it then that we see cooperation in the real world? Well, most likely the explanation is that in real world, we just don't play an isolated version of the prisoner's dilemma. Like what we rather might play is actually like most people I see again. Like it's not that we only play the prisoner's dilemma now, but there is a chance that I meet you tomorrow, then there's a chance that I meet you the day after tomorrow. So we play this prisoner's dilemma over and over again. And now you might think, okay, like what's the difference? Like just because I play it over and over again, like still the same logic should apply, but that's not true. The difference is that in this repeated prisoner's dilemma, you have access to much more complicated strategies. Like, for example, one strategy, a simple strategy that you could use is, for example, just this all D. Like I defect in every single round. So this is perhaps a somewhat complicated representation of this. Like the first round I play D, and then whatever happens, I play D again. But you could have completely different strategies. Like one strategy that is sometimes useful for proving things is actually the strategy Grimm, which is probably the harshest strategy to enforce cooperation, which is I cooperate in the first round. As long as you cooperate as well, I continue with cooperation. But if you betray me once, I defect forever. And a third strategy that is quite famous is the strategy tit for tat, which is I cooperate in the first round, and then I do whatever you did in the previous round. So if you defected, I defect. If you cooperate, I cooperate. Yeah. And so this is these kinds of strategies have been explored now for decades. Optimal behavior in the repeated prisoner's dilemma has been intensely studied. Now, what we are mostly interested in our group, in addition to this repeated prisoner's dilemma, is what actually happens if there's some asymmetry. Like, for example, it could be that cooperation is much more valuable to you than it is to me. And then it's no longer clear whether strategies such as tit for tat would be actually effective, because like the whole logic why tit for tat might be a good strategy for the repeated business lemma is I can hurt you as much tomorrow as you can hurt me today. And if the game is asymmetric, that's actually not longer true. And if you want to have a real world example of that, you might want to look at the US and Canada and the asymmetric games that they're playing there. And another thing that is interesting from our perspective is like once the game is asymmetric and people are just intrinsically different, it's actually no longer obvious how people would adapt their strategies. Like, for example, one important process in our theory is like imitation. But if people are intrinsically different from each other, it's no longer clear how people would imitate each other's behavior, because a strategy that is very good for you might be very bad for me. So this is one question that we are curious about. And we are not the first ones to ask these questions, like, for example, like also in the realms of climate change prevention. People ask this question, like, how does wealth inequality affect this kind of behavior? And usually what these studies find is that the more unequal players are, the less cooperation you get. And I guess the question that we were interested in is how general is this finding? All right. So now, being proper game theorists, now this is the question that we have. Like, this is the interesting behavior that we want to study. Now I need to tell you what is the model. Like, how do we translate this into something that mathematicians can handle, for example? So this is the model that we used, at least. Like, we consider a group with n individuals. In the beginning of each round, each individual gets some endowment. Like, you could think of this endowment as money or time that I have at my disposal. And then individuals independently decide how much they contribute to some common effort. And they know that their contributions are multiplied by some productivity factor Ri. So, for example, for every hour I invest, the public good increases by something that is actually worth even more. And then whatever the public good is worth, like whatever the output is that we created, like it is evenly split among all the individuals, among all the group members. And then after each round, again, we assume repetition. There is another round with some probability. OK, this is now a lot of text. Let me give you a picture. So this is kind of the situation. Like, here you have 3 players. These 3 players have different endowments. For example, you might think that player 1 has 100 euros, player 2 has 30 euros, player 3 has 20 euros. Each of them can decide how much of this endowment they can contribute to this public good. The rules are such that whenever I decide to give €1 to this public good, it will be doubled. So instead of €1, there would be €2. Then it's evenly split among all players. So I would get back 2/3 of my own contribution. And if you think of this game, like, what is the optimal behavior if this game is only played once, it would again be not doing anything. Like, not doing anything, but hoping that everyone else will contribute. That's actually the best thing that can happen to you in this situation. And if there are PhD students around here, this might actually remind you of project work. I hope it doesn't. Yeah. And so the question that we asked is, OK, like, if this is the situation, and suppose you are a social planner that has some discretion on how to allocate the endowments among these individuals, how should you do it? So for this question to make sense, like, I assume that endowments are somehow normalized. Like, there are 100 euros in total. You ask yourself, if there are these 3 players, how much of this endowment should you give to which player? All right, so this is the model. Now we can actually do some math. And we would start with the classical game theory math, like where we are interested in equilibria. So this is actually what we do. Like, also what mathematicians like to do is start with the simplest possible case. The simplest possible case in this case is that players happen to be equally productive. So there is no further asymmetry in this game. And then you can ask yourself, OK, like, how should I allocate this total of 1 endowment to these 3 players such that I get an equilibrium with full cooperation? OK? And the way how you can represent the result is by showing it on a triangle. Like, this triangle actually shows, like, represents all the ways how you can allocate the money among the 3 players. Like, for example, this corner would mean that you give all the endowment to player 1. This corner would mean that you give all the endowment to player 2. This cross here in the middle, for example, means that you give all the players an equal share of the endowment, like 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. And what you can do, like if you do the mathematics, you can characterize where in this triangle you can actually sustain full cooperation in equilibrium. And here you would get this blue region. Now, what is interesting about this blue region is like the blue region never touches the corners. Like you should never give all the endowment to one player. And the other thing that is interesting about this blue region is like it actually covers the center point. And that actually holds true more generally. Like you can change the parameters of this game, but as long as there is a blue region, it always covers the center. And you could conclude from this that actually the best thing that you can do is to split the endowment equally. All right. Now, this is another extreme case. Now, one player is much more productive than other players. And it turns out, if you do the math here, it's no longer true that you should give the same endowment to every player. Rather, you should give more of the endowment to the most productive player. Okay? Now, the mathematicians in this audience might be a little bit disappointed because they might have this feeling. They might have the impression, okay, I told you what the model is. I told you what the result is. I didn't tell you anything about how I derived this result and which steps I did along the way. That's fair. I'm afraid this talk is rather math-free. I can tell you a little bit, like there is actually interesting math in there because like as you change parameters here, like for example, if you reduce the continuation probability that they meet again, this blue region would shrink and at some point it would degenerate to a specific point. And you can actually characterize this point as an eigenvector of some specific matrix. So there is some math hidden in there. I just decided to remain silent about it. Yeah. All right. So this is what you get from a classical game theory point of view. The next step would be to perhaps look at evolutionary game theory point of view, like assume that players are not rational, they don't automatically settle at the Nash equilibrium, but rather they learn how to play the game over time. So we did some simulations there, and long story short, it's just that if people play this game naively, we would still predict that here an equal share of endowments would be best, as in the classical game theory model. Whereas here, actually an unequal distribution of endowments would work best, as predicted by the classical game theory. Now you might be skeptic, like those people who don't like math. You might be skeptic, okay, I don't believe you. So one thing that we did in this particular experiment is actually we tested it. We tested it with an experiment. So what we did here is instead of groups with 3 players, we actually looked at groups with 2 players. And we systematically varied 2 things, like whether they have equal or unequal endowments, and whether they have equal or unequal productivities. And it turns out if you do this, in this case, you actually get 5 treatments, because like if you have unequal endowments and unequal productivities, like it can either happen that you give more of the endowment to the more productive person, or you give more of the endowment to the less productive person. All right, and so what theory would predict is that if people have equal productivities, full equality should lead to more cooperation and endowment inequality. And yeah, this is actually what we find. So if people are equally productive, you see more cooperation with full equality, like with if they have equal endowments, than rather if they have unequal endowments. And now, if people have unequal productivities, actually our theory will predict that the best thing that you can do is actually give more of the endowment to the more productive player. And again, we ran the experiment, and this actually is what we find. So again, like in terms of cooperation, they are almost the same, but in terms of welfare created, actually aligned inequalities, like if they differ in their endowments, it's much better than if you give equal endowments to all players. All right. Yeah, so this is a little bit about the effect of asymmetry in teams. So this is one of the projects that we have been working on. And one question that we are interested in now, for example, is like, how would this game unfold in different societies? Like, obviously, we have done this this experiment now with a British subject pool. Like, you might ask, like, to which extent would you get the same result, for example, if you played with Chinese? And that's one thing that we have done. Also, like, you might want to ask, like, how does this result depend on the specifics of this model? This is also something that we want to explore. All right. Okay, so let me go to another application of game theory, just to make sure. Yeah, so this is now about social norms. Like, and just to have an example in mind, like one social norm, for example, is that on Sundays you should go to church. This used to be a rather strong social norm in Austria for some time. Another social norm is, for example, that you ought to review a paper if you are invited. Yeah. And here the question is like, how do such social norms evolve? And how do they go away? And to answer that question, like first, we need to have some common understanding what a social norm even is. So for the sake of this, I would argue that a social norm consists of two components. Like the first component, it tells you how you should behave in a certain situation. And the second component would tell you, how do you deal with people who misbehave, who don't stick to the social norm? So for example, in this example, the social norm could be just on Sunday, you go to church. And the second component would need to tell you, okay, like if your neighbor doesn't go to church, like how do you treat your neighbor? Yeah, and perhaps also this church example tells you something that norms can change in time. Like these are not set in stone, like they come and go. And for a game theorist like me, this is good news because it means that we can use evolutionary game theory to make sense of this phenomenon, like which social norms are meant to stay and which go away. Yeah, and like in our group, we are even more specific, like which norms can actually sustain cooperation. Yeah, and the way how we do it, again, I need to tell you like a little bit a model. Like we would put it into a model, like again, you have a population with n individuals, like individuals would randomly meet each other and then they can either cooperate or defect. But the others now observe actually what happens. So I can see exactly, for example, Thiago cooperated with Bernd. And I might actually use then this information to update the reputation of Thiago. I might think, for example, oh, Thiago did the right thing. So from my viewpoint, he's a good guy. Okay. Also, this model actually assumes for simplicity that there are only two kinds of reputations, like good or bad. Like it's a very black-white kind of model. And the strategies would then tell the players how to assign these reputations, like what do I think of Thiago when seeing him do certain things. But also it would need to tell me, how do I act if I run into Thiago and now I'm asked to cooperate with him? Would I do it or would I rather refuse to do so? All right, so these strategies are even a little bit more complicated than the strategies that I showed you previously. Like, for example, these strategies would need to determine, like, for example, if a good person helps another good person, is this good or bad? Are there any opinions? It seems rather good to me, yeah. But if a bad person defects against another bad person, is this good or bad? Perhaps not entirely clear how your own moral compass would decide this question. And now if you do the game theory and just calculate what are the strict Nash equilibrium in this strategy space. By the way, so this is the idea. In this example, there are two bad guys, two good guys. Then the bad person would help a good guy in this example. And as a result, you would update the reputation. So you have kind of this dynamical system where these reputations are continuously updated. Yeah, and if you now do game theory on the system and you calculate the Nash equilibria, like it turns out that there are 8 different social norms that would give you full cooperation and are stable, like that are a Nash equilibrium. Yeah, for example, all of them, as your own inner moral compass told you, good cooperates with good, that's always assessed as a good thing. Like if you see a good person cooperate with another good person, that's always assessed as good. But also these 8 social norms would actually not give you a clear rule. If a bad person defects against another bad person, there's no clear rule on how you should assess such a behavior. All right, and now you can of course do the math, but you can also actually ask, like, how do actually people, like, how does this actually map to the social norms that people have? You can even do this with small kids. So actually in this small experiment, they did it with, I believe, 6-month-year-old infants. You might ask yourself, okay, how do you even run such an experiment with 6-month-year-old infants? So this is the press release that they've produced. Like it reads, infants prefer a nasty moose if it punishes an unhelpful elephant. So what they did is they used little toys and they played little situations and then they checked how these little infants reacted. All right, Now, in this model of Otsuki and Iwasa, it's hugely influential for the field. But you should note that there are some hidden assumptions here. Like, for example, the assumptions here are that all interactions are perfectly observable. Also, that all individuals actually share the same assessment rule. So in a nutshell, like how this looks like is a little bit displayed in this figure. Like in this figure actually displays what we call an image matrix. So what this image matrix tells you is, for example, like what does player 2 think about player 1? If there is blue, it means player 2 thinks good of player 1. And what you see here is that there is this strict column structure. And what it means is actually that everyone, like if player 2 thinks good, player 1 is good, everyone else thinks the same thing. Like they all have the same assessments. There is a perfect correlation in how people assess others. And you might think that this is actually a rather extreme assumption. Perhaps the more realistic thing is that people sometimes have incomplete information, or even if I observe Thiago doing something to Bernd, I might misinterpret what happened. Also, like I might actually have a different moral compass from whatever your moral compass is. So perhaps in that case, a more realistic scenario is this one. So that there will still be some positive correlation of what we think about each other, about third parties, but it's no longer a perfect correlation. And now one interesting question is like, once you have these small little disagreements, what's the further dynamics? Would these small little disagreements spread? Like, would they get bigger and bigger? Or would they actually get corrected by the social norm? So that's one thing that we are particularly interested in. Like, for example, one thing that can now also happen is a society like this. Does anyone have an interpretation of what this society actually represents? Exactly, it's polarization. So now the society consists of two different clusters. Every cluster thinks that the own cluster is awesome and that the other cluster is bad. So this can come out of these models. Of course, one needs to be careful if I think of your presentation. But yeah, that's a different topic. And now what people also do is like there's actually a lot of research now on this private information model. Like, for example, people now ask, okay, if there are all these problems, like how can we get rid of these problems? And for example, like there's research being done on what is the role of empathy here. Like, for example, if I see Thiago doing a bad thing to Bernd, I shouldn't assess it from my viewpoint. I should try to think of, like, perhaps from Thiago's perspective, it makes sense. Another thing that researchers do is actually like, who knows? Yeah. Another thing that researchers explore is actually what's the role of gossip here? Like all these models that I've told you about so far is that people just do their thing. They never exchange opinions with each other. But for example, if you allowed people to talk to each other, perhaps this player 2 would actually realize that player 1 is that he's wrong about player 1. Player 1 is actually a good person. So this is the kind of research that is done here at the moment. I'm afraid I'm now running out of time, so I won't present the third example. Yeah, so all that I wanted to convince you with this talk is actually like that game theory is a great tool to make sense of strategic behavior. And also something that I wanted to convince you is actually for game theory to make sense, it's not necessary that people actually understand that they are playing a game. It's not that they consciously make decisions and try to outguess the opponent. Like it even makes sense if people are very naive about their decision making. And the second thing that I tried to highlight is that why ITU is a perfect place for me, because everything here is very interdisciplinary. Like we use the tools of computer science, of math, of physics to make sense of questions in theoretical biology or psychology or even philosophy. And that's why I'm grateful to be here. That's also why I'm grateful to all my lovely collaborators. And with this, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Christian. Are there any questions?
Yes. Thanks for the nice talk. In your second example, I wonder, do you know whether is it possible to have a model to account for at which stage the individual changes their opinions after receiving some input from others?
Just to make sure. Okay. So in this model, like the models with different reputations, and now I observe you doing something.
I decide to change my opinion.
Okay.
So I wonder whether the models can account for that exact moment the individual change their opinion, and then we will have like this dynamic process.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great question. Like in real life, for example, you might assume that I have multiple observations of you, and then over time I might change my opinion. It's not accounted by this particularly simple model because like it's really like every time I observe you doing something, I would update my opinion. So when I update my opinion, it's itself not a strategic choice here in this model, but I'm sure one could go much further.
What about if players are either anonymous to each other or know each other? How does that change the behavior?
All right. So if they know each other, like for example, one interesting question here, like here I studied like direct reciprocity, what I do if I meet repeatedly with each other. Totally different from how do I act based on reputations. So they were two completely different things. But in reality, you might actually have both. Like I might know from personal experience that Thiago is a great guy, but I also listen around and sometimes people tell me he's actually not as nice as it seems. And then the question is like, how do I actually combine these two pieces of information, and which piece of information should I actually weight more? So there's also nice, interesting game theory models to do there.
Yeah, Chris?
As someone who studies kind of decision making and strategic behaviors as extensively as you do, how do you go around the world and knowing what people do? Do you become overly conscious about it?
Not at all. Just to make sure, do I come across? Yeah, do I come across as exploiting you all because I understand all your decision making? Yeah, to be honest, I don't use this in my daily life at all. The only instance in which when I sometimes use this logic is after the fact. I use game theory to make sense of, oh, I saw this behavior. What is it like probably, what were the incentives of this person most likely, if I believe in game theory, that would make sense of this behavior? So that's actually the only instance in which I use game theory in my daily life. Yeah.
Would you say that? Oh yeah. Everything is
To talk, like strategically, it makes sense for me here now to lie. Yeah.
Daniel.
Do people also model like anticipatory behavior? Like I have an inner model of all of you, and you have an inner model of me, and then you might have a model of how the game is actually going on without knowing the full game. And this changes over time. I know the game better and better. And do you model this also? And there's evolutionary branch.
Yeah, sometimes a little bit. Like sometimes, for example, what we do is that we assume that the population consists of different types, types that value cooperation and types that don't value cooperation that much. And by observing your past behavior, actually, I might update my Bayesian belief that you are one of these types. And that actually helps me making better predictions or change my strategy against you in future. That's right, yeah. I mean, here I also assumed that over time players learn which game they are playing because the game played is constant. You might also look at the world where the games are changing in time and where you need to update your belief about what the game is that you're currently playing.
This is like playing Uno with a 7-year-old or something, because the rules keep changing.
It's rummy and it's a 5-year-old, but I know exactly what you mean.
Okay, thank you, Christian. Well, with this, we come to our second speaker. Yeah, Ben Wagner. He started studying political science at LMU University of Leiden. So you already see like there's this tendency to go to the Netherlands. He then went to the University of Pennsylvania and did a postdoc there. And then he did postdocs increasingly building different kind of centers, research centers, and then coming back to Vienna, and then also building another center, research center at the TU Delft all of this work encompasses technology as well as human rights. So we're like now in a totally different realm of things. But I could bet that you two can actually cooperate in the future. So please.
Thank you very much. And yes, as you've heard, I think the talks that you're going to hear now may seem different, but I'm at least going to try and make the case that between the last talk and the talk that you're going to hear now, there's actually more similar than you might think. Because even if the topics that I'll be talking about are slightly different, we'll be talking about more about democracy and less about handbags, still the core scientific challenges are very similar. Whether we're talking then about measuring or changing the world, at the end, doing science, understanding things deeply is often quite a similar challenge. So like every type of research, all of the interesting things we're trying to do start with an interesting question. And for me, the puzzle that I was facing, the struggle that I was facing, is that it felt like in some way my research was doing strange things to the world. Specifically in this case, I've done a lot of work on social networks and social media, and places around the world started threatening that unless immediately Europe stopped regulating large online platforms, the US was going to do all sorts of very strongly worded things to European decision makers. So unless there's these decisions made, unless there are these consequences, there will be consequences for European decision makers. And I felt sort of weirdly responsible for this. A large part of my research for a long period of time has all been about trying to understand how you can regulate these online platforms. And I sort of wondered, maybe I was partially responsible for this. Maybe I'd done something that I shouldn't have been doing, and I was screwing up the relationship between the US and Europe in the process. But to understand how it got to that point, a little story and a little backstory of understanding first. So once upon a time, this is in 2008, as you can tell, a while ago, I was trying to study Arabic, not doing very well, but trying to study Arabic, and simultaneously responsible for a part of a very large German computer network. So working in IT while studying something relatively humanistic. So in case you're wondering which of them, that's there in the corner. And I was also responsible for part of this node O, which is sort of a specific node in a computer network doing relatively boring system administration stuff. But I was doing this systems administration work, this very technical work, from Tunisia. At the time, while learning Arabic, a relatively authoritarian country with all sorts of weird things happening in the network. Basically, to simplify it in a sort of less technical sense, the internet was sort of broken, and I didn't understand why. So I tried to understand and to think about why the internet was broken and what was going wrong. And I realized over time that it wasn't broken by chance, it wasn't a technical fault, but there was a lot of intentional behavior by the government and by other actors in this sense to ensure that different things were filtered, different things could and couldn't be done, and different things were intentionally made impossible to users of this network. So what do you do when you're 22 and you're confused by things? You write a paper about it. And this paper was my first attempt at trying to understand this combination of technology, society, things happening, all sorts of weird things going on with packets, but those packets having very weird consequences. Because this is one of the very few implementations you can find anywhere in the world where they weren't just trying to spy on the traffic, which is common in many parts of the world, especially in very authoritarian states, but they were also trying to edit the packets as they flowed through the networks and literally edit people's emails, which is quite unusual and quite crazy to imagine. And this was quite difficult to prove technically. So I used this then to also write different papers about this, which were later used in different contexts in sort of different online platforms to show what was happening and what the government was doing with people's online traffic, which was also then, I at least hope in some small way, useful and helpful to support some of the people who were a little bit frustrated of what the government was doing. And a few years later, you saw there was a large revolution that started in Tunisia. And also, we then worked together with different journalists who actually won quite nice awards for all of their work, showing not just that this editing was happening, but it was happening with European technology. The technology that was created in Europe was directly used in an authoritarian context to change the way people were able to access the internet. So get a nice research paper, your friends are going and creating a revolution, and somehow people are winning journalism prizes. It seems like quite a nice way of doing research. Like this seems like maybe it can be like this all the time, right? It's great. So with that experience, and still, as I said, quite unexperienced as a researcher doing it. I thought, great, well, I'll just write a bunch of books about this and see what happens. And when you start doing that and you start trying to develop an idea of what it might mean, you're not entirely sure sort of where it fits. So as you saw, part of the reason that there's this long list of institutions that are sort of meandering back and forth, that's about 6 different disciplines and faculties where you're sort of going through, and each one you try to explain, well, this is this sort of research. Well, yeah, this bit we like, but can you leave out that other bit? Keep doing it again, and then go to the next place, and they tell you the same thing. And after a while, you just basically try to find places where you don't have to explain yourself anymore, which is why you end up in a place like ITU. But also the effect of what you're doing has a wider effect, which is this now Digital Services Act, which is partially based, and you can find it in the explanation of why this law was created at an EU level, several little references in different places about directly the research that we did. And you can also then see that this has consequences. This is literally the law that the Vice President of the United States, the current one, was complaining about. Why are these Europeans regulating Elon Musk's platforms? Well, because we've done human rights and technology research, we can understand why that's the case, and we can also understand what it means. But first of all, when you ask and try to understand what it is, this is me attempting to ask an AI what it says when it believes or thinks human rights research and technology research, what it would look like. Which one do you think is the American and which one do you think is the Chinese AI? Any guesses? Which one's from China, which one's from the US? China's on the right, and the one on the left is? It's the other way around, I'm afraid. The Chinese one has the dangerous people waiting in the background, so you might want to hide your phone. And despite all of the things we might assume about the US or see right now, it's still very much this idea of sort of the UN and values, and at least the AI developed there. What that tells you about the specific context remains to be seen. But these are sort of visions you get when you try to generate images on these topics. But specifically, when you want to study these sorts of things, you end up with a lot of things related to sort of technology and society research that's trying to understand the context of how to do research that understands what effects technology has in society, but also trying to do this sort of legal research to understand the effect it has on people's rights. So not just to limit it to say your behavior is changing or your life is changing, but also are there things that you should have access to legally that you don't? And this then requires, of course, engagement with lawyers, statisticians, communication scientists. There's a wide variety of disciplines involved. Also designers to try and then ask, how would you design systems that could be different from that don't have to just work in this way? And the nice thing is that it then allows you to reimagine a little bit what technology could look like, to not just have to say we're stuck with these systems, but we also have alternatives if we choose to use them. So one example of this is with quite a fun project we did with the largest Austrian online platform to show users different versions of experimental research. You've heard about experiments before. This is a field experiment, trying to basically test out if we show people information about how their behavior is affecting other users, how they respond to that. And the interesting thing about it, at least for me, when you think about it in this sort of impact-oriented regulatory context, none of the research suggests that saying to people they will have negative consequences, so you can see the red handcuffs here, that there will be some kind of negative consequences, that they're like the law will come and get you, has any effect on people's behavior, at least in the experiment we tried. Whereas telling people you're part of a community and this has a big effect on the overall community, this is what we call in social science the logic of appropriateness, has a much bigger effect. Acknowledging that there's appropriate behaviors has a bigger effect than just threatening people with consequences. Now, that's just a very specific limited experiment, but it speaks quite nicely to the previous talk, where we're trying to design experimental scenarios, of course with a control group as well, to see how we can nudge or influence people's behavior. Another nice example is to look then at the consequences for breaking social norms. So this is an attempt to map out how online platforms deal with content that they don't think should be on the platform, and they claim that it's breaking the law. In almost all of the research that we've done, we've found that platforms completely misinterpret the law. They block too much and too little at the same time, and when they block things, they block the wrong things. So you're constantly in a situation to having to say, well, this is what you've deleted, this is what we think you've got wrong, and this is where we think you should be. You notice there's relatively little overlap between the area where we think the platform should be and what the platform's actually doing over here. So the difficulty there is constantly to understand, interpret, but then also give clear instructions of what should be from our perspective in a legal context, and then be able to go back to the platform and say, I mean, it's nice that you think you know what the law is, but we think the law is this and it's totally different. What are you going to do about that? And then the third one is this is again different. This is when Twitter was still called Twitter and not X, or Elon Musk's platform, and trying to reinterpret the way that they were communicating things related to community standards and illegal online content. And the point of this is basically to show how platforms design interfaces in a way to nudge users towards behaving in certain ways. So in this case, they had a process that was very difficult and very annoying, which Facebook had instituted, which would quite easy if you complained in the context of community standards, but was incredibly long if you complained in the context of the law. And so they're essentially trying to make it difficult and annoying to access legal rights, which you can still do because you have to do it legally, but will make it so annoying that in the end you won't bother. And we could then show this, document this, and show that this essentially wasn't an easily accessible interface. One of the nice side benefits of doing research like this is at the same time that we did this research, Facebook actually got fined millions of euros for having such bad interfaces because they were meant to be easily accessible. So at least in small ways, you can also show how this research can have a sort of direct and tangible effect on society. But also what you really notice in this context, and it's a bit awkward, it goes a little bit beyond what we've discussed now in the previous talk, is that not just are there these experimental decision scenarios taking place all over the time, but especially in online environments, all actors are trying to grab and hold off and push around on users. So there's this constant attempt to nudge and manipulate user behavior. There's this constant attempt to try and find some way of getting them to click one button slightly faster, slightly slower, to get them to buy things, to get them to act in a certain way. And there's a lot of debate in the sort of the technology and society research community about what this means, that a lot of the new technological infrastructures are basically being built to steer human behavior. Now, the steering of human behavior you see in lots of economic contexts, obviously, but increasingly those infrastructures are also being used in political contexts for obvious reasons to steer people in a certain direction and to create certain forms of user behavior. So when you think about that from a scientific context, a lot of the time the challenges that we face are not just economic. So a lot of the time it's easy to reduce the understanding of the steering of human behavior just towards economic questions. How do you get people to buy things on the internet? How do you get them to look at advertising? But a lot of the problems that we face in society are not just economic. So for example, we have a large research project now called ReSocial with different universities in the Netherlands and elsewhere to try and understand how people are actually facing harms in digital contexts and what that then means for their behavior. So for example, if you face a lot of online aggression, are you less likely to then want to become a politician? If you are specifically facing that because you're part of a marginalized group, does that then mean we have less marginalized group people being part of political groups? And we're trying to measure that and study that because we believe that these are the sorts of questions that should be studied, but that are not always easy to study and are certainly not economically going to be studied on their own unless somebody makes the effort to actually try and study them. Now, this changing the world as a measurement problem is the reason for this talk. And I mention it also in the context of the scientific questions that are being asked right now in many parts of the world. When we talk about academic freedom, it's extremely important to remember that this is a very valuable good, and we shouldn't give it up lightly. And we also shouldn't feel the pressure to replicate questions that are already being asked elsewhere, because it's nice we can get slightly better answers. But in the world of science as it exists right now, if you can't measure it, it doesn't actually exist. So to measure something, to give it recognition, to acknowledge it as a relevant research question is itself a powerful act. And it's also why independent research is so incredibly important. In my field, it's very, very common for researchers to take money from Google, from Facebook, from Meta, from other large organizations. And to a certain degree, that impinges on their independence. Now, that's not to say that nobody should ever do that in any situation. It's rather to say the independent researcher who does technology and society research, who is never taking money from those organizations, becomes more rare. And over the time, their independence will be questioned. But also, there's so much technology shaping society in so many different ways that it's quite difficult at this stage to make any meaningful statements about the changing world that human beings experience. So you'll have parents asking questions about how their children use social media. You'll have people asking questions about online elections. And honestly, even for the people who are directly responsible for that, a lot of the time, the answer is, sorry, we don't have data on that. We can't give a good answer to a lot of these questions. And so what you then have is that a lot of technology and society questions that are big impacts on society are decided with an incredible lack of information. And so I think, and I hope that for the next years and the next decades, if we can build up enough information in time before people stop asking or stop us asking these questions because they've become uncomfortable, as we can see in the US right now, that allows us to actually make better decisions about the societies we want to live in. Now, I especially want to mention that to students because I think there might be like one or two maybe in the room somewhere, perhaps. And it's so central. We say these things and it seems so silly and meaningless when people obsess about the questions that you have and the questions we ask and think about. But it's actually really central. A great question is incredibly powerful, even more so perhaps than a great result or a great output from research. And if you underestimate the power of the questions that you ask, you completely miss the possibility that scientific research provides, which is that there's incredible beauty and incredible ability to ask unusual questions, science literally making society stronger, but only if you're asking questions that are sufficiently difficult that even you yourself feel challenged by them. And so that's why it's sometimes confusing and frustrating, wondering why do we even bother asking these hard questions? Because they're the only ones worth studying. Everything else is nice and interesting and easy and comfortable, but not the really uncomfortable questions that you'd really like to know the answer to. Those are the ones that are worth taking the time for. And also in this slightly more scientific context, let's see if I can get to the next slide. Oh, there we go, one back. It's interesting to do this at a university in the context that we are now. So this is the poster that you can also see over there. It's one of the first statements that was ever made by ITU's president, Stephanie Lindstedt, about the idea of what it could be to be at this university, to be at ITU. And I also think it's a fantastic way of thinking about what a university in general could be in the best sense. I'm always reminded when we think about this in context of like what it means to be unusual, what it means to be different, what it means to ask different uncomfortable questions. And in a lot of places, both in the world and at different institutions, those questions are uncomfortable and difficult. People doing unusual paths, doing unusual things aren't always welcome. And so to know that there's places where those unusual questions and the uncomfortable paths to get there are not just welcome, but accepted and celebrated is a powerful thing. And it's a special thing to be able to say that difference is embraced. In a sort of more general sense, and this is going away slightly from the talk, but I thought it's important, it's what you could call the sort of the Statue of Liberty model of an organization, which is the idea that difference is celebrated and valuable, and that all forms of difference are welcome. That's not to be taken for granted, and that's not the typical thing that you experience everything in the world, but it's also something really valuable to aspire to. So if you're trying to imagine these sorts of questions and how you get back to technology and society research, this is where I started. And this is where we're trying to go, trying to then build programs based on that of what it might look like to do law, technology, and society with interesting partners. Also, what it might look like to do human rights and technology research, which is still a really tiny field of not a large group of people, but with incredible demand. Because again, if we can show that it has a direct consequence for human rights, it often leads to state action. So this fits into sort of a broader argument that I think we live here at ITU on a daily basis, but I don't think is so obvious, which is that a lot of the more traditional technical research is already present in many parts of the world. But the socio-technical, the interdisciplinary technical research that includes technology with something else is actually not that common, actually quite difficult and challenging and uncomfortable, but also quite interesting. And I would suggest that that's where the interesting questions are going to come in future from a scientific perspective, because it's also incredibly difficult to do. To say whether democracy and social media are going to be compatible in some way is no easy, interesting question, but it's perhaps more relevant than some of the technical questions about optimizing things. And so broadening this concept of what it means to study technology in democratic societies, I think, is really important. We can't allow ourselves to be limited by what disciplines or what people who are sitting in funding agencies think is relevant, but rather we are publicly funded institutions who have the possibility to study, in principle, anything we can imagine. And that's a really valuable and beautiful thing, but we also have to cherish it and use it. So when you talk then about a democratic context, what is really interesting, and it's strange, but it's also a measurement problem in and of itself, is that the digital transformation that we see in societies across the world, strangely, for reasons that are causally very difficult to explain, coincides with a crisis in democracy across many parts of the world. Now, I'm not going to say that the two are incompatible, because I don't think it's true, but certainly many of the crisis in democracy contexts are connected to digital technologies. And there's a direct connex, for example, between the way a lack of societal participation or the lack of accountability for decisions made is linked to having privatized power outside the immediate obvious control of the state. And that privatized power causes all sorts of democratic problems. The same goes for lack of governance, but most importantly, the lack of measurable data. If we can't understand what it would be for things to be good, we can't change them. And this lack of measurability, if we want to change the world in a positive sense, we need to be able to measure what the problem is and identify a solution. And that can only be done with better data, better science, better measurement. So all of this sort of connects, and I would argue leads to a degree of low citizen trust in digitized societies. But again, none of this is causal. This is all coincidental. There's a lot of research to be done to demonstrate in many different contexts what's going on and what consequences that might or might not have for the societies we live in. So when I look at this question again, coming back to like, am I screwing things up between the US and Europe? Well, maybe, but it's also a little bit messier than that. So if you remember, the technologies we think about are also the technologies we create. Once upon a time, when we think about technology, we dreamed about funny IT people and flying cars. The reality that we see right now is not funny IT people and flying cars, but a dog that is somehow responsible for 3.3 million people, which are estimated to die in the next 12 months, and swastikas. So it seemed like the reality is much more dark and uncomfortable than you would imagine. And yet that doesn't have to be the reality we project. That's just the current situation that we see. We could also still have funny IT people and flying cars, but we also could imagine technologies as liberating things that go beyond it. Given the current status quo of technology and the debates about it, it's almost easy to forget the context within which technology was a liberating force that helped people communicate and think differently about the societies they live in, or technology as somehow promoting and supporting democracy. But that's the story that we've told ourselves, and that can still be a relevant story that exists. We just have to imagine it and want to believe it. And these positive ideas of what technology and democracy could be, I believe, are central to being able to ask the right type of research questions. Because it's not so much about getting stuck in the things that we see, but it's also not about ignoring them. And then getting from the point that we stand towards a point that is imaginable about a different form of democratic engagement towards technology. Because when we look at the way that the design of systems exists right now, we find primarily attempts to create transparency rather than accountability. And accountability, at least as a central democratic tenet, is quite central. We find a lot of pushes for ethical frameworks rather than human rights, which I again would argue is insufficient. And a simple lack of measurement, the same basic problem. If you can't measure it, you can't change it. If you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. So sadly, we notice that in many ways, digital transformation is not per se democratic, but it also could be. And the could be is the central point there. There's nothing per se any about it. It's not good, not bad, it's not neutral, but it's certainly possible. And to allow for that possibility to become something that guides the questions that we ask, and to allow for an imagining of something that is slightly more possible, we can have these beautiful ideas of what democratic societies could look like. We can have these imaginary tech futures that really are positive. By the way, it's really difficult to find positive images of technological futures. It's really, really hard. You spend a long time looking for those images, and even after you've spent a lot of time looking, it's still hard to find them. But they do exist. And there are things that we can hold on to, even if it's hard and uncomfortable. And I think the path towards doing so involves asking the right questions. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, now the DNA of Ben in political sciences has really shown itself. Thank you very much for this great talk. Other questions? Yes, Daniel.
And it's a bit of an egoistical question because I'm just interested in how you think about this. So I think the measurement problems is, of course, not just this one dimension that we cannot measure, but a different one. And there is the thing called Goodhart's law. I don't know if you know it. So if a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. I'm just interested in how you think about, like, okay, once you measure something, what to do with it.
I think it's a really good point. And I think the challenge is that in a lot of these situations, first you have to sort of widely understand society. And once you've widely understood society, there's an open question of what you need to do about it. So the Digital Services Act or other EU regulations are a great example of that, where they're trying on the one hand to provide more data to researchers and sort of help researchers understand things, but also separately then trying to define what is good behavior for platforms. And the honest difficulty is there, it's hard. And it changes all the time. And it's something that you constantly have to adapt to, and it gets gamed and it gets manipulated, and there's all sorts of different responses to that. But there's no comfortable, easy answer. You don't have a like, oh, we do all of this and be done. But rather you're constantly then adapting the targets, adapting what understanding this is, and the measurement problem doesn't go away. But what you can say is that right now we don't even have like the body of knowledge and literature, sort of trying to map the space. And that's quite challenging, but it's also not impossible. It just requires asking enough of these hard questions.
Anybody? Yeah, Chris?
Yeah, I want to follow up on the measurement problem and maybe put back a little bit on your statement. Like, look, you can't measure, it doesn't exist, right? Because I think that would also be understandable. In your argument goes like, as soon as we can make something measurable, it becomes changeable. Right? And obviously, you can go about that problem making more things measurable. And this seems to be, what you're proposing. But also, you can work it from the other end, right? And say like, maybe, we can change things without having it measured, but simply because we love it, right? How do we do that? And can we change the system so that politicians would maybe also trust some knowledge, some insights, some expression that is not measurable, and change the law because they see things are going wrong, right? Because without us necessarily being necessitated to kind of put a number on it and say like, see, this is what happens.
So I think it's even a few steps back from that. So there's, I'm sure you're familiar as well, some great research by James C. Scott that shows very nicely how different societies in the world work hard on not being measured and not being governed. But he spent a lot of time traveling in the world to find those societies. And if we're honest, they're quite rare. Like there's very limited space to not be measured and not be governed. And the act of being ungovernable is difficult. And of course, there's let's say, a violence of measurement where then you reduce things in a certain way to a model of understanding. And then that is only then presentable in a certain way, because also you need to reduce it to a way that decision makers can understand. That's part of the set of challenges. And I totally agree on it as a very legitimate critique. I think it's a very reasonable way of thinking about it. But there's also the other side where you have, let's say, people responsible for making sure that the internet is safe, or people responsible for responding to criminal, in many different contexts, who don't even begin to understand the basics. So we're not talking about so much the squashing things into boxes and filling it in a certain way to then have something, but rather to even begin to get some kind of understanding of the causal mechanisms. Like, in which context are certain things healthy for young children? In certain other contexts, how far do you need to go before things start tipping in a certain direction? In which context do people understand in a meaningful way what is disinformation and what isn't? And there might not be easy answers to those questions. They might be uncomfortable or difficult, but without this sort of base level of let's say, basic scientific knowledge to sort of structure the debate, you can't even really have a conversation about it because you don't know what is causally linked, and it might be exactly the other way around. So without having this sort of base lay of the land, like a basic map, you can then have conversations and you can appeal to people's values, but those values may differ on any given day and in any given political context. So I don't disagree with the point you're saying. I think it applies more to, let's say, much more studied and understood areas of society where then additional measurement and additional sort of governing causes problems, as opposed to areas where it's so underdeveloped that there's, let's say, a lack of even basic understanding. And then it's sort of like grasping in the dark to understand the problem that isn't even clearly there. Does that answer your question? Thank you.
You had a question, I think. Yes.
Yeah, so very nice talk. I was wondering, I believe in China there is a certain type of like a social score,
Yes.
where people are receive a score based on how soon they pay taxes, if they are always, I don't know, early on certain commitments. I believe in the Western world it's a little bit of a taboo topic, this thing of like treating or giving privileges to people based on certain way that they are scored. So, but then at the end, measuring social phenomena may end up in a certain trend where measurement is going to be done and people are cannot be judged by certain metrics. So, what are your thoughts on that happening in the Western world?
I feel that the example itself is difficult because often when this is talked about in the West, we have a certain understanding of these things where we then project things onto China without fully understanding what's happening. And also without, like, it's not that we don't have credit scores, right? Like we are not so dissimilar perhaps sometimes as we think. And I think this is one of the things that I find quite interesting in my research, that the clear distinction between a democracy and an authoritarian state is in many areas not so clear. And that doesn't mean now that there's a better or worse in general terms, but it's actually interesting from a scientific perspective, because then you can start saying, what are the behaviors that are good or bad? And so the behaviors you're drawing on, it depends on how collectivized or individualized they are and what consequences come with them. So in the example of Christian now, what are the consequences of diverging from the certain social behaviors that are acceptable? And that depends on context, it depends on how the institutions are designed, and that also depends on finding mechanisms to show the way out of these sorts of the exceptions to the rule. And they can then be fair or not fair or just or not just, but I find it very difficult to do it based on this, let's say, abstract example of somewhere far away, which we don't understand very well, if that makes sense.
Okay, so I think let's bring up Christian also to the podium, so you can open up questions for everybody. And so for my first question for the both of you would be, what's your first collaborative project?
Perhaps this is a behavioral experiment, I guess.
Have a lot of fun.
Yeah. I trust my PhDs and postdocs come up with something.
We've already been discussing quite a bit. So no, we've already been discussing in some detail, and because there's a lot of interest in my group also about these different experimental designs, but often we don't have the people who have expertise in doing these experimental designs over many decades. And so having that expertise and then trying to question the assumptions that are made behind them is something that was already ongoing. So
Great. Are there more questions from you guys?
Questions where we can disagree on. You know?
Well, I always have. Oh, Karen.
I think that one probably very technical question concerning the experiment. Then you mentioned about consequences in postings.
Yes.
I was wondering how was that done in the experiment, because you could say I will punish you with consequences, but it's different from what we experience right now. When posting about Donald Trump means you get fired. So I wonder how we really can map that into an experiment with the same impact.
it's very difficult, and you're constantly trying to work out when you show these treatments to people how users interpret them and whether they then think what you think, like whether this is a consequences thing or whether they then think about, I don't know, what is appropriate behavior and these sorts of things. So for that specific group, we even worked with Austrian comedians to try to understand that if we sort of made it sound funnier, whether people would understand it. They didn't, so we didn't use the comedians. But it's basically you're constantly, it's this what we call the problem of other minds, where you're constantly wondering how the other person interprets and what it means and how they'll understand and what you're trying to say and whether it's coming across. And it's never perfectly fully resolvable. But at an abstract level, this sort of very simplified, like they're very abstract concepts of social science, this sort of, and also in like game theory, right? They're more like appropriateness-oriented things, more like following social norms versus more like punishing bad behavior, are different ways of dealing with similar problems. And the interesting thing is that in like a lot of digital contexts, a lot of lawmakers say, if we just increase the fines for people, if we just send them to prison longer, then people will understand and stop this behavior. And that's not really what our research suggests. So punishment may not be the right pathway to always finding these things. And there's lots of other similar mechanisms you could build. So for example, you don't have to make people use their real names, but you can make the pseudonym sticky in a way that like you need to spend a certain amount of time using a certain pseudonym before you can post something, and thereby creating a cost for diverging from the platform and breaking the rules. So there's all sorts of different ways you can design systems to encourage good behavior. But this is then in a sort of online context, and I guess from a theoretical context, you could do even more.
That was a bit too spontaneous. I didn't see this coming. My forward-looking behavior was not appropriate. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
We will discuss much more.
How did you actually start researching, getting into game theory?
I mean, it's a little bit long story. Initially, I wanted to study physics because I always wanted to understand time and space. I couldn't, Gerd, I will have a conversation with you. But back in the days, I couldn't start, like I started in March, so I could only start with mathematics. So I stick to mathematics in the end. And there, within mathematics, the best lecture that I heard by far was game theory, because within mathematics, like it combined a lot of different areas, like stochastic processes, differential equations, linear algebra, and all this kind of stuff. But I was also amazed, like, by all these like findings in economics and these findings in psychology and how it relates to biology. Like, I guess that's where I got attracted to this kind of research.
And you? How did you?
I told the story in great detail, but I can tell it again if you want.
No. Okay. Any other question out there? Yes.
Yeah, so basically, because we're talking about sometimes also standards for these things, right? And when we talk about human rights, it's very easy to say we have water, we don't have water, right? And so on, right? But do you think, and because measurable is one thing, we measure inequality, but if you write an economics paper and you just say, okay, let's find ways to decrease it without saying why it's bad, you still have to say it maybe reduces growth and so on. We don't fight it necessarily. So do you think there has to be a little jump, like back in the perception of what is a human right in terms of individual rights, or what we should be asking for in terms of privacy, in terms of all this online rights that are not really considered human rights really for the average citizen? Maybe you do consider them that, but the average citizen doesn't really consider privacy a huge human right.
So there are studies which suggest that in many ways they do, but also there's a lot of different misunderstanding of like what it means to have rights and what it doesn't. People don't really, the rights aren't tangible for them, right? They don't know that like Facebook is broken or this is broken, it doesn't work. So then they don't think about the reasons why and that they might have rights. So being aware that rights can exist and that they can be relevant for you is already a big step. It's very true. But also conceiving of sort of normative questions around rights, even if it seems quite political, and in certain ways it is, helps take away a little bit sort of the individual subjectivity by focusing on sort of codified existing rules that exist and you can refer to. And then looking at those codified existing rules that it can exist, there's actually a lot of rights that we don't really talk about because they come from different parts of the world where they may be stronger or weaker. You know, when it talks about like social justice or right to housing, that might be very strong in, let's say, in parts of Austria, for example, but it might be very weak elsewhere or vice versa. So there's no, let's say, linear, clear, clean understanding of these things. But that doesn't make the questions uninteresting to ask. If anything, it makes it interesting to ask and understand whether people would want these things. And if they had them, would they act differently in a way that is sort of beneficial beyond just that? And so you can both ask in terms of the questions that they would be beneficial beyond just that. And let's say, I know, promotes economic growth. But also a lot of the time, when you start making things transparent, people say, well, actually, hang on a sec. If people are being really nasty to each other online, that's not actually something we want. And so making things transparent makes obvious so many things that are unreasonable and unacceptable that they almost change by themselves, if that makes sense. Not that it's always perfect or easy, or that it's like very straightforward, but the obviousness of, let's say, behavior that is negative to human rights not being good, you could, as we've heard now, show it to a 6-month-old and they'll also sort of understand that this is not good. Now, that doesn't then mean that it changes overnight, but the putting a spotlight on it makes it much more difficult to do in an everyday normalized way. And so then either it goes to hide or there's other sort of forms of adaptive behavior to avoid being seen. But still, the asking of the question itself has quite a powerful effect. Does that answer your question? Not really. Insufficiently.
Can't say yes or no, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, now only questions are allowed to a Christian because Ben always answers in a 3-hour talk, so we have to somehow limit it. Yes?
Sorry, I don't know how to articulate here, but I try my best. From the viewpoint of game theories, evolutionary game theories specifically, is it even possible to reach to the positive picture that Professor Wagner said? Will this picture maintain the balance? While when everything gets perfect, then it will be the moment for the sneaky people to sneak in, and then everything again gets worse.
So you mean, are we doomed?
The game theory point of view.
Run away from being
I mean, there is actually a very similar thing in biology. Like there's a thing called the Red Queen effect. It's like among this coevolution among parasites and the hosts. And also like the host will build a defense against a given parasite, but then there is evolution among the parasites actually to evade these defenses. And I guess it's called the Red Queen effect because there is this passage in Alice in Wonderland where I believe the queen says that you need to run as fast as you can just to stay at the same spot. And I have the feeling like also here, correct me if I'm wrong, there is this kind of perhaps even arms race where both like institutions try to be ahead of the other party, but also like the other party try to get around it. So I like from my naive understanding, it's hard to find a stable equilibrium, and from then on, nothing will change. It will rather be some dynamic equilibrium at best.
So I think with this, I would like to close this great event. Thank you very much again to the both of you. And I think one thing I take home with me is let's develop positive technological visions for the future here at ITU. Thank you.